The wind carried more than dust through San Rios. It carried whispers. They curled like snakes through the wooden slats of porches, slid under saloon doors, and drifted down aisles of the dry goods store. Murmurs about Jonas Cade, the silent rancher who'd bought off the widow's shame with a tarnished necklace and no words. Most folks had their own version, of course. Old Joe at the stables said Jonas never blinked as Berriman's men pulled the children away. At Miss Layla's tea house, someone claimed Jonas had once served under Sherman himself, cold-eyed and brutal till he found religion in silence. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between the storyteller's lips and the spaces in Jonas's eyes. Sarah Dawson knew what they said. She heard it when she walked into town with a sack of butter and preserved apples. Women lowered their voices mid-sentence. Men tipped hats with just enough pause to say more than politeness. "Widow Cade?" One drunk muttered behind her, only to be silenced by his friend's sharp elbow. At the general store, even Mr. Bellows blinked fast when he saw her, and not from the midday light. "Miss Dawson, got the little ones with you?" he asked, voice too bright. "No," she said calmly, placing cornmeal and salt on the counter. "Jonas is watching them." The silence that followed was steep enough to echo. She said nothing more, offered her coins, and left. Out on the homestead, Jonas chopped wood without urgency. The old hound rested nearby, one ear twitching at each creak of the breeze. Sarah arrived just before sundown, shoes dusty, but steps purposeful. She handed him the wrapped parcel, though her eyes held the weight of things unsaid. "They're talking in town," she murmured. Jonas didn't pause. "Let them." Sarah looked past him, toward the hills touched gold by evening light. "They think I should hate you, or thank you more than I've earned." He glanced up, sweat-drawn lines shadowing his face. "What do you think?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then said, "I think I was cold, and you gave us fire. That's all." A nod passed between them. No promises, no reparations, just steady hearts and worn bodies, weathering what storms would come. Behind them, the whispers kept swirling, but out here, truth spoke only in action. Dust scratched across the streets of San Rios like restless ghosts as the morning sun beat down on the weathered rooftops. Folks gathered near the market square, where word had spread like a prairie fire. Something unusual was set to happen. Hank Berriman had gone and dragged the Dawson woman out, dead and all. Atop the makeshift platform, Sarah Dawson stood rigid, arms wrapped around her 3 small children. Her eyes were defiant, but her lips trembled. Beside her, the debt collector shuffled papers with casual cruelty, his voice slithering through the crowd. "Gambled what wasn't his," Berriman drawled, tapping the edge of his boots with a snake-head cane. "And now the house comes collecting." The triple, tears clung to their mother's skirts, their small faces flushed with fear. The youngest hiccuped a soft sob before Sarah hushed her gently, eyes darting back toward the leering crowd. Men leaned against posts. Women whispered. No one stepped forward. In a town where kindness cost more than gold, silence ruled. A chuckle broke from somewhere behind the crowd. "What's next? Sellin' widows like horses." "Only if the horses owed money," Berriman quipped, earning a few grunts of mean laughter. As a burly man stepped toward the stage, intent unknown, Sarah gritted her teeth and put herself between the man and the children. "Get off that stage," she warned. "These babies ain't yours to take." "Oh, but they're his to collect," another voice muttered. Then silence crept in strange and sudden, like all the air had left the town. A tall figure at the edge of the crowd shifted forward. Broad-brimmed hat low over his face, boots silent upon the dry earth, Jonas Cade stepped into view. The sun glinted off something in his calloused hand. A worn silver necklace caught the light like a prayer. No one said his name, but the whisper slowed. Jonas climbed the steps without word or show until he stood beside Sarah and her children. "I'll cover her debt," he said, voice leveled with dust and mercy. Berriman's brows twitched. "And what'll you pay with, ghost man?" Jonas held up the necklace, fingers steady. "My mother's. It shimmered in the sunlight. The crowd held its breath. The morning air carried a hush, heavy with the scent of tilled earth and wood smoke. Jonas Cade stood just outside the cabin, the necklace cradled in his calloused hand, its silver dulled by years, yet no less weighty than the memory it bore. After days of absence, the silence between him and Sarah held more meaning than 1,000 words. Sarah stepped from the doorway, a checkered rag in her hand from drying dishes. Her children played near the stables, their laughter faint but steady. She didn't ask where he'd been. She just looked at him, eyes steady, heart unsure. Jonas opened his hand. The necklace gleamed in the filtered sunlight, its tarnished surface catching light like a promise long buried. He didn't offer it with ceremony, just the quiet strength of a man who kept his word, despite the cost. "I told you I'd get it back," he said, voice low but clear. Sarah took a step forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. Her breath caught, eyes drifting from the necklace to the man holding it, then back again. "You shouldn't have parted with it to begin with," she whispered. Jonas didn't answer. He only lowered his hand, as if to lay the weight not just into hers, but into a life they might slowly learn to share. But Sarah raised her hand halfway, then stopped. Is this for me?" Jonas searched her face. "It's not payment. It's not charity." His thumb grazed the chain. "My mother gave it to me in the last days before war took everything we knew. That's all I had of her. And now, it's the only thing I have worthy of giving you." A hush settled between them. One of her children called from the distance, but she didn't move. "I'm not someone's debt anymore," she said. "I'm done being owned." Jonas nodded, a small flicker behind his serious eyes. "You're no one's to own," he said. "Just someone to be stood beside." Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached out and accepted the necklace. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. Seconds passed. Then she stepped forward and rested her head lightly against his chest. Not a surrender, but a beginning. Jonas wrapped one arm around her, gentle as the wind through blooming sage. Storm had begun long before the thunder. In Sarah's heart, it had lived there for months, since her husband's last breath rattled through their worn-out cabin, since the debt collectors circled like scavengers. But on Jonas Cade's quiet ranch tucked into the hills, that storm found no place to howl. He didn't speak much, didn't ask where she came from or how broken she felt, just nodded once and opened the crooked door to a warm room that smelled of pine and earth. The children nestled in quilts shaped like autumn leaves. Sarah sat near the hearth, not knowing whether to cry or hold her breath. Jonas returned just before dusk, with arms full of firewood and his dog padding behind him. He dropped the wood without fanfare, glanced at the triplets, and walked back into the cold with an axe. That was how he was, showing kindness beneath silence, like a field blooming quietly after rain. She watched him from the window, his shape black against the flickering sky, and wondered what he'd lost to make him so quiet. Days passed in the hush of rebuilding. Sarah milked goats, mended clothes, learned the rhythm of his land like a woman relearning the shape of hope. Jonas repaired a broken fence post with hands calloused and precise. She watched his long shadows stretch beside him and realized he always fixed what others threw away. Perhaps that's why he'd stepped forward in San Rios. One night, as the fire cracked low, her littlest climbed into Jonas's lap without a word. He froze at first, startled like a man ambushed by tenderness. Then his arms closed gently, slow and unsure, around the child's warmth. Sarah, watching, felt tears threaten again. Later, sitting beside each other on the porch, wrapped in silence, Jonas finally spoke, not more than a sentence. "You and the kids, you're safe here." It was more than she'd gotten from most men in her life. She didn't answer with words, just leaned slightly, so their shoulders touched. Not much, but enough. In the quiet between two haunted lives, they began to build something that didn't need noise to be real. A shelter not just of roof and wood, but of understanding. A place where silence could finally mean peace. Wind began to howl low through the canyons by mid-afternoon, carrying with it a promise of coming rain. Jonas stood by the porch rail, watching the clouds gather like herds of dark cattle across the far ridgeline. The quiet wasn't right. Not even birdsong stitched the stillness, and he knew enough about storms to feel uneasy. Inside the cabin, Sarah pressed a cool cloth to her youngest boy's brow. The child whimpered, his cheeks flushed red with fever, eyelids fluttering as though caught in a half-waking dream. The triplets usually ran like wild things through the yard, barefoot and laughing, but now the cabin felt heavy with silence and stale air. "His fever's climbing," Sarah whispered, loud enough for Jonas to hear. Jonas stepped in, his eyes serious. "How long has he been like this?" "Since last night." "It's getting worse." "A fever like this, it don't break on its own." Sarah nodded once. "I boiled willow bark, but—" Jonas didn't wait for the rest. He walked over to the old cupboard, pulled his coat from inside, and reached for the satchel hanging by the door. "There's a place east of here, high slope near Talon Creek. There's a root grows there with wide leaves and a bitter smell. It's what my ma used when sickness came fast." Sarah rose, her voice tight. "That's ours. You'll never beat the storm." "I'll ride fast," Jonas said. "He won't make it through the night without it." His old dog barked once as Jonas swung up onto the horse's back. Wind broke through the valley just as the first drops fell. He pushed forward, head down, rain slicing across his face like sharp lashes. Hoofs struck wet stone, and thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, reminding him of other storms, other rides that ended with men buried under gray skies. When he returned, soaked and battered, mud across his boots, Sarah had the water set to boil. Jonas pulled the leaves from his pocket, crushed and shivering. She took them from his hand without a word. By dawn, the fever broke. Jonas sat outside, steam rising from his shirt as the sun climbed behind a veil of rain-washed clouds. From the doorway, Sarah looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time didn't see a stranger. She saw the man who charged into a storm for a child he hadn't sworn to protect, until maybe an wind slid ghost-like through the pines near Jonas Cade's cabin, rustling needles with whispers only a man trained to listen could hear. Inside, the hearth's low embers cast flickering shadows across the log walls. Sarah hummed quietly as she finished cleaning the dishes, her face worn but peaceful, the lines of worry softened by moments of trust, not yet spoken aloud. The children slept nearby, curled in quilts, unaware of the unease beginning to crawl across the night. Jonas sat sharpening his old knife against a whetstone, his motions slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Old Dog let out a low growl, ears pricking. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped outside into the moonlight. The porch creaked under his boots. A scent carried on the wind, leather and horses, faint as a memory. Then he saw it. Knife, driven deep into the cedar post by the door. Its handle gleamed with crude etchings, the mark of Travis, Berriman's right hand. Jonas pulled the blade free, fingers tightening around it, a message meant to rattle. It might have worked on someone else. He scanned the tree line. Jonas didn't call for Sarah. Instead, he disappeared down the side of the house, silent as dusk, following the familiar slope to the pasture. From the shadows, a figure broke away, a man creeping toward the back of the cabin. With the crack of a twig, the intruder froze. "I wouldn't," Jonas said, voice low as thunder across a distant field. Travis turned slowly, hands raised. "Just checking on neighbors, Cade." Jonas stepped forward. Neighbors don't leave steel buried in doorframes at night. A silence stretched between them like a drawn bow. Travis chuckled, not with humor, but pointed menace. "Berriman says you owe what you bargained, Cade. Says you took something that wasn't yours." "I gave silver," Jonas replied, "and a name worth more." The threat hung unspoken, rope taut and ready to snap. But Jonas didn't draw steel. He didn't need to. His presence was weight enough. Travis backed away, shrinking in the cold. When Jonas returned inside, he set the marked knife by the hearth. Sarah eyed it, then met his gaze. "Someone's testing what holds us," he said. She nodded, curling closer to the sleepy warmth of her children. "They'll learn we don't break easy," she murmured. Outside, the wind carried Owen. Each old oak stood near the edge of Jonas Cade's land, twisted, gnarled, its roots drinking deeply of memories. No man planted it, and no one claimed it, yet all who passed gave it space, as if the tree knew secrets it might whisper aloud if given reason. Sarah stood beneath it now, arms crossed against the cold, watching the amber sky dip toward dusk. One of the triplets, Mary, held her hand, eyes fixed on the horizon where Jonas had disappeared hours earlier. He'd gone back into San Rios with the silver and a silence carved from stone. Behind them, the cabin's hearth glowed warm, and the scent of cornbread drifted from the window, but Sarah's heart wasn't in the comfort tonight. Her heart was out there with a man who owed her nothing, and yet carried her hope as if it were his duty. She looked down. At the tree's base, half sunk in dirt and moss, sat a weather-blackened wooden cross, small and forgotten. She knelt, tracing its worn edge. No name, only silence. "I think he buried something here," Sarah whispered. Mary looked up. "A person?" "Maybe a memory," Sarah said, voice catching. From behind, footsteps softened by time approached. It was old dog, tail swishing slowly, muzzle gray. The old hound sat beside them, giving only a quiet whine, neither afraid nor restless. He, too, knew the ghosts. Sarah stayed kneeling. "I used to think losing meant forgetting, but it doesn't. Losing means carrying something heavy you can't see, until you lay it down." Mary didn't understand the words, not fully, but she laid a small wildflower on the cross anyway, her gesture childish and yet sacred. As the winds rose from the canyon's throat and rustled through the oak's limbs, Sarah felt it, grief, not as torment now, but as truth. Jonas had once buried something here, a pain he couldn't hold and a promise he meant to keep. The tree had grown over it, quiet and wide, offering shelter not from rain, but from forgetting. And so she stayed a while longer with the girl, the dog, and the ghost beneath the oak, until far off, the sound of a horse's hoofs echoed steady and sure, like a vow returning. Itchy wind carried a trail of dust behind Jonas Cade's horse as he rode down the bluff road toward San Rios. The town's skyline, a ragged line of timber boards and worn rooftops, rose against the orange hush of morning. He hadn't worn his union coat in years, but it now clung to his frame like a memory, faded yet unshaken. In one saddlebag rode the silver bars he'd kept buried beneath the hearthstone, coins earned in blood, saved in silence. In the other, a single letter Sarah had written but never sent, a note of thanks, folded neatly beside a child's hand-drawn star. San Rios stared as he passed. The silent rancher returned. Children paused their play. Men leaned out of thresholds. The saloon doors buckled lazily as he stepped inside. Behrman sat at his usual corner table, flanked by his wolves. The room quieted, cowed by a wind, not from outside, but from the weight of memory and meaning that rode in with Jonas. He walked to the bar and placed the silver down, bar by bar. Each one landed with a clean, cold thud. "This pays the widow's debt," he said evenly, voice clear as spring water, yet strong as canyon stone, "and buys back the necklace." Behrman rose slow. "Money doesn't wash away what's owed in pride, Cade." "No," Jonas replied, "but it keeps men honest." Behrman's fingers twitched toward the grip of arrogance, but the room had shifted. Jonas met every eye with quiet weight. One of Behrman's own barkeeps stepped back. "I'm not here to fight, only to settle." Jonas paused. "My mother died with lips chapped from begging. I won't see that story told again." A beat of silence, then another. "Fine, take it," Behrman muttered, flinging a small pouch onto the bar. Jonas picked it up gently. Within was the tarnished silver chain glinting like moonlight caught in ash. He looked once at Behrman, and then turned without a word, stepping back into the rising light. Behind him, the town whispered. Ahead waited a promise kept, a family restored not by force, but by choice. And with each step his boots pressed into the dirt, the land remembered something about honor, how sometimes it rides in quiet and leaves as legends teach. The sun hung low over San Rios, its heat casting long shadows that danced along cracked boards and dusty boots. Townsfolk paused as they saw the man on horseback, a lone figure, lean and straight back, Ed, riding with the quiet determination of someone who knew which burdens were worth carrying. Jonas Cade's coat bore years of dust and weather, but his eyes were clean and clear, steel-colored and steady. He didn't speak as he tied his horse outside the saloon. He didn't need to. Inside, the room buzzed with low talk, cards slapped on tables, and the sharp scratch of a fiddle tuning aimlessly. Behrman sat at his usual spot, flanked by cronies. The town's rough men knew him, respected him, feared him. But when Jonas pushed through the saloon doors, the room fell quiet, like air holding its breath. He moved to the bar with the weight of silence, pulled a small pouch from his coat. It hit the counter with a thud. One by one, silver bars clinked out, worn, marked by time, savings from a life spent working land and fighting ghosts. The crowd watched, the clink of silver louder than a gunshot. Behrman rose, face twisting in a greasy grin. "You come crawling back, Cade?" Thought this debt was buried. Jonas calmly removed his hat, placed it down beside the silver. "It wasn't mine to bury. I came to settle it. The widow walks free. My mother's necklace is mine again." Behrman spat on the ground. "It don't work like that, quiet man. You don't just walk in and rewrite the law." Jonas's voice was even. "You cannot buy honor, but I just paid for my soul." A stillness overtook the room. Somewhere in the back, a glass clinked. Then old Walt, who hadn't stood straight in years, tipped his hat. A woman by the door crossed herself. The town, for once, stood not with fear, but behind justice. Behrman, seeing it shift, faltered. The necklace slid across the counter. Jonas pocketed it. Nothing more was said. He left without fanfare, but in his wake, something heavier than silver had changed hands. The necklace sat heavy in her palms, a tarnished silver thing dulled by time, heat, and sacrifice. Its metal was warm, traced 100 times over by memory and silent promises. Sarah turned it slowly, watching the firelight flicker along its curve, like distant lightning on a quiet prairie night. Jonas stood across the room with his head lowered, hands clasped behind his back. He'd not said more than a dozen words since returning from San Rios. She had heard the townsfolk whisper as he rode in earlier, some with awe, others with doubt, but for the first time, not pity. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice barely above the wind that curled along the cabin walls. Jonas looked up. His eyes, so often unreadable, held something vulnerable now. It was never about the silver, or the name, or what people thought. She clutched the necklace, the weight of all it meant pressing into her skin. Then what was it about? Jonas stepped closer. "About finishing a story I should have stopped long ago, before my mother died cold and alone, before I let silence speak louder than my actions." Outside, the triplets laughed faintly in the distance, chasing each other near, the orchard they'd helped Sarah plant weeks earlier. Inside, another tree was growing, roots threading between two souls weathered by different storms. She looked down at the necklace again. "This belonged to someone you loved." He nodded. "She wore it until the end. I kept it so I'd never forget the cost of inaction." Sarah held the necklace up, letting it dangle between them. "Then why give it to me?" Jonas breathed in, his voice barely a rustle. "Because you remind me that love isn't loud or grand. It just endures, like silver, even when the shine fades." A stillness settled between them. Finally, with careful fingers, she reached up and clasped it around her neck. It rested just above her heart, fragile as hope. "I'm not yours," she said, chin lifting. Not unless I choose to be. Jonas nodded slowly, something like peace settling in his chest. Then choose. And when she smiled, small and true, he knew she already. Each wind moved gently through the grass behind Jonas's cabin where Sarah knelt, planting spring beans with careful fingers. Her hands, weathered yet graceful, carried both past ache and present hope. The triplets ran barefoot nearby, their giggles echoing like distant bells across the field. Jonas stood a few paces away, watching, not overseeing, just witnessing, a peace he hadn't known he longed for. Old Dog dozed in the sun, chest rising slowly beneath a patch of blooming wildflowers Sarah had coaxed from the stubborn dirt months ago. They'd taken root with quiet determination, not unlike her. "Too dry today," Sarah said without looking up, patting the soil around the final seed. "Sky's blue as a polished tin cup. No rain coming soon." Jonas nodded, his shadow long beside hers. She dusted her hands and rose, brushing her apron. "But maybe we're due some good seasons." Jonas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped away from the porch and reached into his coat pocket. From it, he drew the tarnished silver necklace, the one he'd fought so quietly, so fiercely to reclaim. He held it out, open on his weathered palm. "It belongs to you now," he said, voice nearly lost to the wind. "Don't mean it as property. It's a vow, one I make freely." Sarah looked at the necklace, then up at him. Her eyes shimmered. "I'm not anyone's property anymore," she murmured. "But I'll be yours, because I choose to be." She reached forward and closed his fingers over the necklace. "You already gave me more than silver. You gave us ground to stand on." The sunlight warmed them where they stood, two souls reshaped by shared storms. Behind them, the triplets darted through rows of baby sunflowers, chasing butterflies and laughing with reckless trust. Jonas took her hand, and they walked forward together, toward the growing things, toward the laughter, toward the unknown with no fear. Above them stretched a wide, open sky, endless, unjudging, and waiting. Here, beneath it all, they found not just shelter, but roots. Quiet, sturdy, and finally home.